Winona Ryder's story does not begin with red carpets or flashing cameras. It begins in quiet places, in isolation, in a childhood far removed from Hollywood fantasy, where books mattered more than popularity and imagination became a refuge. Rather than a hobby, because long before the world knew her face, Winona learned how to live inside her mind, how to observe rather than perform, how to feel deeply in a world that often rewards noise over sensitivity, and that sensitivity, often mistaken for weakness, would later become the very force that made her unforgettable. Because Winona Ryder was never built to shout for attention. She was built to linger, to haunt, to stay with you long after the screen faded to black. And growing up away from mainstream culture, raised in an environment that valued thought over trends, she developed something rare in an industry obsessed with surface, depth, and depth always carries a price. Because when you feel more, you also hurt more. And Winona felt everything, the isolation of being different, the weight of not fitting into traditional molds, the pressure of being misunderstood before she was ever truly seen. And yet, instead of trying to harden herself, she leaned into that difference because she didn't know any other way to exist. And that honesty, that refusal to pretend, quietly shaped her into someone who could bring truth to characters that others could only imitate. And when acting entered her life, it wasn't as an escape, it was an extension, a way to express emotions she had been carrying silently for years. And even as a young actress, there was something unmistakable about her presence. A vulnerability mixed with intelligence, fragility paired with quiet strength, a sense that she wasn't acting emotions, she was revealing them, and audiences felt that immediately because truth recognizes truth. And while Hollywood often tries to mold young talent into digestible images, Winona resisted being flattened, not aggressively, not loudly, but simply by being herself, choosing roles that reflected complexity rather than comfort, characters who were outsiders, thinkers, rebels, women who didn't need to be explained to be understood, and this choice mattered, because it set her apart in an industry that often punishes those who don't conform. And as her career began to rise, it didn't feel manufactured, it felt inevitable, like the world had finally discovered someone who had been fully formed long before fame arrived. And yet success did not shield her from struggle, because being seen does not erase insecurity, and being admired does not quiet inner doubt. And for Winona, the sudden intensity of fame collided with a personality built for privacy, creating a tension that would define much of her journey, because while the world celebrated her uniqueness, it also scrutinized it, analyzed it, labeled it. And that scrutiny can be suffocating when your strength comes from introspection rather than armor. And Winona found herself navigating an industry that wanted more of her image but less of her humanity. More access but less complexity, and this imbalance planted the seeds of conflict, because when you are praised for being different but punished for being human, something eventually breaks. And yet, even in these early stages, there was resilience forming beneath the surface, a quiet determination to remain authentic even when authenticity came at a cost. And this resilience would later be tested in ways few people fully understand, because Winona Ryder's story is not just about fame. It's about survival, about identity, about disappearing and returning stronger, about learning that your value does not disappear when the spotlight turns away. And as her career accelerated, as her face became iconic and her name synonymous with a certain kind of intelligent rebellion, the pressure mounted, not just to succeed, but to stay frozen in a version of herself the world felt entitled to own. And that expectation is heavy, because it denies growth, it denies struggle, it denies evolution. And Winona, whether consciously or not, refused to remain static, because she was still searching, still feeling, still questioning, still human. And that humanity would soon collide with an industry that has little patience for imperfection, setting the stage for a fall that would redefine not just her career, but her understanding of herself, her worth, and her strength beyond applause. And this is where her story truly begins, not in triumph, but in tension, not in perfection, but in pressure. Because what makes Winona Ryder inspiring is not that she rose quickly, but that she learned how to endure quietly. And what came next would strip away illusions, expose vulnerabilities, and force her to confront the hardest truth of all, that sometimes losing everything publicly is the only way to rebuild yourself honestly. As Winona Ryder's fame surged, it did not arrive gently. It arrived like a wave that does not ask whether you are ready to breathe. And for someone whose strength came from inward reflection rather than outward performance, this sudden intensity created a quiet struggle that few could see, because from the outside she looked untouchable, iconic, admired, the face of intelligent rebellion and emotional depth, yet inside she was navigating an industry that often confuses visibility with invincibility. And Winona was never invincible. She was perceptive, sensitive, and deeply human. And those qualities, while powerful on screen, can become burdens when the world demands constant certainty and flawless composure. And as her career reached its peak, every role, every appearance, every word became magnified, analyzed, and archived, leaving little room for rest or privacy. And this relentless attention began to erode the boundaries she needed to stay grounded, because when your life becomes a public artifact, it becomes difficult to remember who you are without reflection. And Winona found herself caught between who she truly was and who the world expected her to remain, a frozen image of youth, mystery, and perfection that did not allow space for growth, confusion, or vulnerability. And this pressure quietly accumulated, manifesting not in rebellion but in exhaustion, because it is exhausting to be watched constantly, to be defined repeatedly by strangers, to be praised for qualities you are not allowed to change. And while many celebrated her success, few recognized the cost of carrying it alone, because fame often isolates those who are most sensitive to its weight. And Winona, rather than hardening herself or performing in vulnerability, continued to feel deeply, which made the eventual breaking point not a shock but a consequence. Because when you are asked to suppress your humanity for too long, it eventually surfaces in ways that confuse the world but make perfect sense to the person experiencing it. And when her personal struggles became public, the reaction was swift and unforgiving, because society often celebrates vulnerability in art but condemns it in real life, especially in women and especially in those placed on pedestals. And Winona's fall from public favor was not gradual. It was sudden, dramatic, and deeply personal, turning a human moment into a cultural spectacle. And what hurt most was not the criticism itself, but the speed with which admiration turned into judgment, as if success had erased her right to struggle, as if talent had canceled her humanity. And in that moment, the same world that once celebrated her uniqueness questioned her worth. And the silence that followed was deafening, because opportunities faded, conversations stopped. And an actress once considered untouchable found herself invisible, and invisibility after fame carries a unique kind of pain, because it forces you to confront whether your value was ever truly understood. And during this period, Winona faced the hardest challenge of all, separating who she was from how she was perceived, learning to exist without applause, without validation, without the reassurance of relevance. And this is where many people disappear completely, not just from the spotlight, but from themselves. But Winona did something quietly radical. She stayed, she endured. She allowed herself to feel the loss without numbing it. And that endurance was not passive, it was transformative, because it forced her to rebuild her sense of identity from within rather than from recognition, to ask herself who she was without roles, without praise, without the illusion of permanence that fame creates. And this internal work was slow, uncomfortable, and invisible, but it was essential, because it taught her that worth is not maintained by consistency of success, but by consistency of self. And this realization did not immediately bring her back into favor, but it grounded her in a way success never had, giving her clarity, humility, and resilience that could not be taken away by public opinion. And while the world moved on, as it always does, Winona remained, learning how to live quietly, how to observe again, how to find meaning outside of constant productivity. And this period of absence, often misinterpreted as failure, was actually a gestation, a time where strength was being rebuilt away from noise. Because sometimes disappearing is not quitting, it is healing, and healing rarely looks impressive from the outside, but it prepares you for a return that is honest rather than desperate. And when Winona eventually began to reemerge, she did so without apology, without explanation, without the need to prove she still belonged, because she had already proven something far more important to herself, that she could survive the loss of identity and come back grounded, self-aware, and whole, and this quiet resilience would soon reshape not just her career, but the way the world understood her.